After the success of the original Final Fantasy, which ended up selling more copies in North America than Japan, Square were desperate to release further Final Fantasy games in that region. Significant progress had been made on localizing Final Fantasy II, with complete English script even drafted. This had been overseen by Ryoru Moriyama, whose primary job was in the Japanese Public Relations Department, and members of Square's North American division, including the senior VP and even the accountant, ended up spending their evenings combing through the scripts to fix phrasing issues and other language oddities, despite knowing next to nothing about the game itself. With the localization so close to completion, promotional materials were even produced, but due to a combination of market conditions and issues around internal logistics, the game never saw a public release. Final Fantasy III then suffered a similar fate, but Square were adamant that this trend could not continue. It's why the localization of Final Fantasy IV received such significant focus and attention, but when it then released and didn't perform in line with expectations, Square started to become quite concerned. Based on the growth the franchise had undergone in Japan, Square had anticipated similar growth stateside, and given that the original Final Fantasy had outsold its Japanese counterpart, selling over 700,000 copies, they had anticipated Final Fantasy IV selling over 1 million. When it then ended up only selling around 300,000 copies, there was an incredible sense of disappointment and underwhelm. But instead of attributing this to market conditions, changes in publishing strategy, or their own marketing tactics, the blame was placed firmly on the audience themselves. Final Fantasy IV had undergone significant adjustments to make it more catered to the North American market. There were concerns that, due to numerous issues arising that prevented the release of Final Fantasy II and III in that region, the transition would be too extreme for those who had played the original game. With Final Fantasy IV selling so poorly, there was a belief that they just hadn't done a good enough job to help North Americans with the transition. Despite their best efforts, they believed the game was still too confusing for them to understand and too difficult to navigate. This assumption, and the sales themselves, led to a lot of trepidation in Japan, and the subject of improving sales in North America relating to Final Fantasy became a prominent topic at board meetings. They did, however, after numerous discussions, come up with a solution. Based on what they believed to be the problem, the board decided that releasing another mainline entry in North America would be tantamount to a terrible idea that had the potential to confuse the audience further and start to create negative brand sentiment. What they needed to do instead was to train North Americans to better appreciate and understand how and why Final Fantasy was evolving, so that when the next major follow-up was released, it wouldn't be so jarring. Having become convinced that this was the correct course of action, and seeing how well the Saga series had performed on the Game Boy in that region after being rebranded as Final Fantasy Legend, it was decided that a North American-centric Final Fantasy game should be produced, and that the relatively new Square Saga team, who had just developed Saga 3, was best placed to deliver it. Ever since its formation, Square had always been based in or around Tokyo. There had, of course, been numerous obvious moves, as the business was forced to adjust in line with its commercial performance, but maintaining a core presence in that region had always been the main goal, as the talent pool was so strong. Square's internal structure had also ebbed and flowed in a similar manner. Throughout the initial years of the company, multiple teams were formed, led by the likes of Sakaguchi and Tanaka. But after the breakout success of Final Fantasy, a more conservative approach was adopted. It was only once Final Fantasy had consolidated its position in the market that the leadership team were willing to consider expanding out again. Kazuhiko Aoki was the first to be given a bit more autonomy, tasked with overseeing quirky, low-budget games like Kunjaku Hero, but his team were also expected to help out with bigger projects where necessary, even if it meant sacrificing their own ambitions. Akitoshi Kawazu was the next to break away from the core Final Fantasy spine, tasked with forging his own path on the Game Boy, and due to the success of the first Saga game, which became the first property developed by Square to sell over 1 million copies, Kawazu was allowed to continue being autonomous. His next task was to develop a sequel with the hopes of turning Saga into a franchise that could coexist with Final Fantasy and help to mitigate financial risk. Saga 2 ended up shipping over 850,000 copies, accomplishing the task. But due to when Saga 2 launched, right at the end of 1990, Kawazu had a difficult decision to make that wasn't too dissimilar to one Sakaguchi had faced the year before. He could continue to support the Game Boy by producing another Saga game for that audience, or he could aim bigger, working with Nintendo to transition the Saga franchise to becoming a much grander, complex game in 16-bit Super Famicom. Similar to Sakaguchi, Kawazu decided to do both. Saga 3 was planned to release on the Game Boy, and Romancing Saga was planned to release on the Super Famicom. But the approach Kawazu took to ensure his vision panned out as expected couldn't have been more different from what Sakaguchi did. Instead of expecting his core team to work on both games simultaneously, Kawazu focused all of his efforts and those of his core team on Romancing Saga, and Saga 3 was then handled by an entirely new team at Square that was being built out in Osaka. Square Osaka was formed in February of 1990, while Saga 2 was still knee-deep in development, but it had been in the making for some time. Towards the end of 1984, 3 video game companies who had similar mindsets believed that by adopting the spirit of cooperation and friendly competition, they could each grow faster in what was becoming a hyper-competitive space. These 3 were Soft, Winky Rabbit, and Crystalsoft, and together they formed the Trinity Software Group. Other developers took note, and throughout the first half of 1985, Falcom, BPS, System Sarcom, and BoothTech all joined the Trinity Group. With such a significant increase in membership, the Trinity Software Group was renamed, becoming the Super Software Team, or SST for short, and membership continued to grow, with Game Arts, Cosmos, Ubisoft, and Square also accepting. Due to there now being a massive pool of resources, the companies helped each other out on a consistent basis, and the easiest way to show the support was by producing ports for systems that were previously out of reach. Dexter, for example, had been released on the PC-88 by Game Arts, and they commissioned Square to work on a port for the Sharp X1, while Square also assisted Falcom by porting Dragon Slayer to the PC-88 and MSX. The bulk of the SST's activities were around games developed for personal computers, but by mid-1986, the Famicom had started to gain real traction. We saw a similar initiative launched called the Disk Original Group, so that smaller companies could band together and compete with the likes of Konami, Namco, and Capcom. But unlike the SST, which was more of a collective with shared responsibilities and no defined leader, the Disk Original Group saw Square placed in charge of sales and distribution, and anyone else who joined was responsible for development only. Because of this, some members of the SST chose not to take part, as they wanted complete autonomy. 6 members did choose to sign up, and one of them was Crystal Soft. Sword of Kalen was the only game that Square collaborated on with Crystal Soft, but after the dissolution of the Disk Original Group, the two companies remained close. Chihiro Fujioka, for example, stayed in regular contact with the president of Square. When it became known that Square was interested in opening up a Saga development division, Fujioka jumped at the chance. Not long after, Fujioka showed his commitment by convincing Koji Ide and Yuji Sasai to leave Crystal Soft as well. And they were then joined by other Osaka-based developers such as Yuki Masada and Takeo Fuji, who worked at Nihon Busan, and some others who also left Konami and Taito. Each had developed different areas of specialism relating to game design, programming, graphics, and music production, and it meant that the team had a solid structure even from the outset. But there was also an expectation that team members adapted to their new environment. This meant some individuals ended up taking on additional responsibilities due to decisions that were being taken elsewhere. As Square Osaka was a new team, none of them had ever shipped a title under the Square banner before. Although some of the individuals who formed the team had worked together on projects at their previous studios, Square Osaka had never worked on anything before as a collective unit. This meant the formation of the team was somewhat unorthodox. Quite often when companies expand, it's customary to have a few senior stakeholders form the leadership team to ensure the company values are upheld and work is delivered in a consistent manner. But that didn't happen here, and this was evidenced with what happened on Saga 3. Kawazu had acted as the brains behind the first 2 games, serving as director, scenario writer, and lead game designer. His DNA was all over the Saga series. But due to the importance of romancing Saga to Kawazu, Square, and Nintendo, he felt it was necessary to dedicate all of his focus on that project to ensure it would deliver. This placed an incredible amount of pressure on Square Osaka. Despite the recency of their formation, they were expected to produce the 3rd game in a franchise that had sold almost 2 million copies, and the person who had led the charge, and had also been a big part of the success of the first 2 Final Fantasy games, was not going to help them in any kind of active capacity. They were also given the knowledge that Saga 3 was to be the last game in that particular arc of the franchise, a swan song on the Game Boy. Such a scenario must have been incredibly daunting, but the team was determined to step up to the plate and show the rest of the company what they could do, and this was what many of them had already been doing for years. When working at Crystal Soft, Fujioka served as one of the in-house composers. He was often credited as the sole composer, but the reality of his job was much different. Working with an array of composers, Fujioka was responsible for coordinating their efforts and porting their music onto the desired systems, doing arrangements where required, and only composing music if not enough pieces had been delivered. Fujioka was also tasked with hiring composers, often through word of mouth. This made him a natural fit to take on the role of producer on Saga 3. Koji Ide, on the other hand, had started out as a graphic designer, but after working on numerous projects, Ide transitioned to general game design, and as he was one of the more senior designers to join Square Osaka, he was installed as director of the game. They tried their best to mirror the wider concepts introduced within the first 2 games, while also figuring out ways to make Saga 3 stand out on its own by injecting their own personalities. This led to some major changes in general game design, but they wanted to bring Saga more in line with regular role-playing games, as opposed to aligning with Kawazu's vision for what role-playing games should be. And Ide even introduced Lovecraftian themes, having been collecting raw materials during his days at Crystal Soft. Upon launch, however, Famitsu gave Saga 3 a 29 out of 40. This was the lowest score given to any of the 3 Saga games, but it was still commendable. There was a feeling that Saga 3 didn't feel like a Saga game. While many people enjoyed the change, others also felt it was a betrayal. Nonetheless, Saga 3 ended up selling over 650,000 units in Japan. This was, again, lower than the previous 2 games. But at that time, it still placed Saga 3 as the 8th best-selling game released on the Game Boy in Japan. And considering who was developing the game and the restrictions they faced, it was pretty astounding that this result was accomplished. Him and the leadership team back in Tokyo were impressed, and as all the other major development teams were busy on existing projects that catered towards pleasing their Japanese audience, the Osaka team were the perfect candidate for attempting to create something that had never been done before, making a role-playing game that catered to a North American demographic. The task of creating a Final Fantasy game catered towards the North American market was not an easy one, and this was for numerous reasons. Based on what had been released and how the market had responded, Square had no real clue what resonated with the market. The original Final Fantasy had sold very well, but Final Fantasy IV had not, despite numerous modifications being made to try and make it more in keeping with what they thought Americans wanted to see. The first 2 Final Fantasy Legend games and Final Fantasy Adventure had also been very well received in North America, having each been nominated at the Nintendo Power Awards. But there was also the added pressure of turnaround time, as there was an expectation that this new North American-centric Final Fantasy had to be released before the next mainline entry. Given the constraints that have been placed on them, the Square Osaka team felt that making a brand new Final Fantasy game from scratch, on their own, with no real guidance, was an impossible task. None of them had received any real exposure to the North American market either, so had no clue what gamers in that region actually wanted to see, outside of hearsay and conjecture, and they also didn't believe it was possible to create a strong enough entry given the time constraints. It meant there was only one logical choice open to them: create an evolved version of Saga 3. Even though they had all been released on the Game Boy, the team knew that the Saga games had resonated well enough with North Americans, and as they already had most of the assets and systems in place, repurposing them for the Super Famicom was guaranteed to take less time than starting everything from scratch. Koji Ide was again installed as director, but Chihiro Fujioka, who had served as composer, arranger and producer of music at Crystal Soft, and then as producer on Saga 3, was assigned a different role in the game. He was to pen the narrative. Fujioka was aware that role-playing games released in Japan had become known for their dense storylines, and Final Fantasy IV had epitomized the notion that the franchise was pushing even further in that direction. But there was a belief that North Americans found the stories too difficult to grasp, and could become frustrated and bored due to there being too much dialogue and character relationships being too complicated to understand. To ensure this didn't happen, the objective was to make the scenario so simple that audiences could understand it without needing any kind of interpretation or additional thought. There was also an active effort to reduce dialogue, and this was achieved in part by character emotions being expressed through animations and movement. Ultimately, they wanted the primary focus to instead be on battles, with the narrative only there as a very simple driving force. Given how well the original Final Fantasy had resonated with North Americans, Fujioka sought to basically replicate that story, while making it even simpler, and he also sought advice from a relatively new employee at the company called Ted Wolsey. Having been hired to help improve Square's localization process, and also being North American, Wolsey was the perfect person to help Fujioka tailor the story. Focus was therefore placed on a single protagonist who was on a quest to restore balance by defeating 4 vile evils and recovering 4 elemental crystals. Then, the task was to defeat the Dark King so as to bring peace back to the land. Although the protagonist was planned to be joined by allies on his quest, Gon was the motif of Warriors of Light, but other more abstract concepts were also removed, such as time travel. After Fujioka had penned the script, he then went through to make everything as literal and easy to understand as possible, so that limited changes were necessary through the localization process. But when Wolsey received the script, he found it difficult to make any real changes due to there being severe limitations on space. The game was tiny, being developed on almost the smallest possible ROM cartridge. It meant there was almost no room for creativity, so most of the names, places and enemies, such as Windia and Fireberg, being home of the Wind and Fire crystals respectively, ended up being retained. The same sentiment was then applied to almost every other area of game design. Masahiro Kabe, credited as Picasso due to his artistic talent, was used to drawing pixel art on paper and then enhancing it, but due to the requirements around making everything simple and easy to interpret, he decided to just input everything directly, as no subtle touches or nuanced design were necessary. Kabe had also heard that young North Americans found bright and contrasting colours much more appealing, especially compared to Japanese children, so he spent a lot of time developing a more vibrant colour palette with the hope that his work would resonate and capture the eye in a more effective manner. Hiroshi Kyonen, who worked with Kabe on map design, embodied a similar spirit. Typical maps had a certain amount of intrigue and rewarded players for exploring without visual cues, but they believed North American players may get bored with this approach, so sought to make everything much more interactive and engaging. The maps themselves were made much more vibrant, and this then translated into the field itself, with traversal and progression designed to be much less passive. Small puzzles were then woven into general exploration and traversal, as they wanted players to feel accomplished when they unlocked new paths. This then made it feel to the player like they had a choice, but the developers had just created novel ways to keep the player motivated without proceeding down what was ultimately a linear path. With so many compromises being made due to either capacity or audience pandering, the game could have ended up being quite bare bones, but effort was placed around enhancing the gameplay as much as possible as a way of compensating for this. From the outset, the decision was taken not to use the active time battle system featured in Final Fantasy IV, as it was perceived as a barrier to entry. They also didn't want to use a vanilla turn-based combat system either. Instead, Ide worked with Katsugori Kondo to modify the system seen within Final Fantasy 1 through 3. This led to them creating a conditional turn-based battle system, although it was never designated as such in an official capacity. Instead of being based around whole party rounds, this new system saw characters and enemies cycle through individual rounds, and the turn order is then based on the character with the highest speed stat. When it was the player's turn, they could then perform a handful of basic options. They could attack, use an item, cast a spell, defend, run, or switch weapons. But another command was also introduced called Control. This then played in with their decision to have the game just focus on one main protagonist instead of an entire party consisting of heroes. Players always had control of the main character, who became known as Benjamin. But as the journey proceeded, allies could be recruited. One ally could then join Benjamin in combat as a companion, and the control command was there so that the player could determine whether they wanted to control the companion manually or have it be AI controlled instead. For the time, this was an incredible innovation. It meant players could tailor the experience to be more in line with how they wanted to play. Prior to joining Square Osaka, Kondo had actually spent a lot of time working on action-focused games and had worked on numerous shoot-em-ups. He had never worked on a role-playing game before, but due to the target demographic, Kondo felt that he could port over many gameplay elements from action-focused games that often wouldn't have had a place within the genre, especially in Japan. One of them was the notion of what happens when the party suffers defeat. In previous Final Fantasy games, and indeed the genre at large, when the party suffered a defeat, irrespective of where they were or what they were facing, they suffered a game over. And when this happened, the only solution was to revert back to the most recent state. Kondo felt that North Americans would take this as a huge point of frustration, and that it could lead to players just getting fed up and not returning. Learning from action-focused games, he instead explored how they could implement some kind of checkpoint system that didn't punish players in such a severe manner. It meant, should players suffer a game over, they were given the option of restarting from the beginning of the encounter, as perhaps their strategy was just bad, and with a few tweaks they could adjust and succeed without being punished for not saving recently enough. Further modifications were also made to soften difficulty and wider points of frustration, such as removing the perilous random battles. Many role-playing games had incorporated random battles in the manner of a separate battle scene to introduce jeopardy, but also as a way of circumventing hardware restrictions. This game, however, innovated by having potential encounters visible on the field, and this meant players had more control over how and when they fought enemies. Implementation was then handled by Kondo and another programmer called Kazuhiko Yoshioka. Yoshioka joined Square Osaka to work on this project, but was known to Ide and Fujioka due to their time working with Crystal Soft. He worked alongside Kondo to ensure everything worked as intended, and he also spent a lot of time on balancing. Despite all of the adjustments, they had to make sure North Americans found the game as appealing as possible. They also wanted to make sure nobody was discouraged by the challenge offered by the game, and Kondo even revealed after development had wrapped that he felt he learned a lot about the youth of America and their interests after working on the game. With everything taking shape and being adapted specifically for the North American audience, the only remaining piece of the puzzle was the soundtrack. Ever since the earlier days of Square, Goro Uematsu had been ever present as their in-house composer. He had written music for their PC-88 games, and the majority of their releases on the Famicom that came before Final Fantasy. After Final Fantasy, he served as the solo composer on the next 3 games, but also on Young Hero, Square's Tom Sawyer, the first Saga, and even Rad Racer 2. But with the number of projects increasing, even though Uematsu worked ridiculous hours and never took time off, everything just started to become too much, especially as the games themselves were requiring more individual pieces of music. The first side of the strain came with Saga 2, as Kenji Ito served as co-composer, and as Uematsu was busy with Final Fantasy IV, Ito took over Seiken Densetsu, the first time Uematsu had not worked on the soundtrack for a Square-developed game. With Saga 3 being developed by Square Osaka, it again made no sense for Uematsu to be involved, especially as Fujioka had been hired. But Fujioka didn't end up working on the soundtrack due to his role as a producer, and it meant the composer, who was also hired from Crystal Soft, was Yuji Sasai. Prior to joining Square, Sasai had worked on countless soundtracks with some of the most notable relating to the Zack franchise. He was therefore very qualified, and countless tracks were written for the game. Due to the quality of Sasai's work, he was then asked to perform the same role again, but this time he was joined by another composer, except it wasn't Uematsu. Keen to expand their department further, talent was attracted from all over, and in something of a coup, they managed to hire Yasuhiro Kawakami from Sega. Kawakami had worked on numerous arcade games for Sega in the late 1980s, most notably Shinobi and Tetris. He ended up forming a strong relationship with Sasai, and as this was to be the first Final Fantasy game where Uematsu did not feature as a composer, they sought to push boundaries and produce a soundtrack that was unlike anything ever seen in relation to the franchise. As the pair had also never worked on a soundtrack together before, or indeed worked at the same company, there was an initial feeling out process where they both wrote sample tracks for various elements of the game. Fujioka then decided which of the tracks was better suited to the vibe, similar to what he had done at Crystal Soft, and it ended up that Sasai wrote more of the harder tracks, and Kawakami wrote more of the softer tracks. In the end, they found that the two styles complemented each other in a way that wouldn't have been possible had only one of them worked on the soundtrack in isolation. But outside of trying to complement their individual styles, they also had to work with the storage capacity restrictions. Similar to the scenario writers, due to the small ROM cartridge used, only a small amount of tracks could be produced. They had to ensure that track length was also kept to a minimum. One instance where this almost became an issue related to 2 of the game's final tracks called Last Castle and Battle 3. Sasai got a bit carried away when working on Last Castle as he was inspired by the scenario and the graphics. This then meant there wasn't much space left for Battle 3, so he had to make do and work within the constraints. This notion was then embodied by almost every aspect of development, and it was further compounded by the very swift development cycle. Initial planning started towards the beginning of 1992, not long after Saga 3 was shipped. The development was completed by July 1992. The game only took 6 months to make. Due to the insane turnaround time and there being no break between the 2 games, once development had wrapped, almost the entire team was given a few months off while the game was being localized and prepared for the North American launch. Unlike every prior Final Fantasy game, where Japan had always been the primary market, this time things were different. North America is now the primary market, and it meant many of the practices previously put in place were thrown out of the window. Those powerful media connections individuals such as Sakaguchi had built over the previous 5 years in Japan to help promote their games and raise awareness were now irrelevant, and in North America they were unable to lean on Nintendo for assistance, having chosen to go it alone. Progress had been made, but they were still finding their feet, and Rad Racer 2 epitomized this. Similar to this new Final Fantasy, Rad Racer 2 was developed primarily for North American audiences, and Square wanted to try and capitalize on the huge sales and impact of the first game. But its sales were poor by comparison, and it was never even ported back to Japan or released in Europe. To ensure the same mistakes weren't made again, the North American branch of Square used their limited media to try and secure coverage, while hoping that bigger initiatives helped to raise broader awareness. The Consumer Electronics Show was established in 1967 as a central place where technological innovations from across the globe highlighted to the media and by proxy, consumers. Square had first attended CES in 1996. Along with members of the SST, they sought to learn more about the video games industry and forge relationships with their like-minded North American counterparts. Their attendance in that particular year led to the eventual hiring of Nasir Jabeli as they connected by the founder of Rodobun, Doug Halston. The Square continued to attend in the years that followed. In 1992, CES had grown to encompass video games in a pretty big way, and many publishers used the Summer Showcase as a platform to announce their upcoming lineups to North American audiences. Sega used the CES to announce the Sega CD attachment for the Mega Drive, and the likes of Mario Paint and Sonic 2 were also announced, alongside peripherals such as the Super Scope and the Menacer. Nintendo, especially, were keen to make their presence felt, as they sought to try and regain market share they had lost to Sega in the 16-bit console war. They hired out almost 2 acres of floor space, but over 70 other video game publishers and developers were present at the event. One of them was Square, and it was here that they revealed Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. The expectation was that announcing their game at such a prestigious event was a surefire way to gain media attention, but the resultant coverage ended up being very sparse due to it essentially being drowned out. In subsequent months, Nintendo Power did not mention Mystic Quest at all. GamePro did, but they waited until their July edition, and even then, the editor didn't highlight Mystic Quest by name. They simply said the 4-meg Final Fantasy Action RPG entry was to be released in October. With there being no strong coverage from the traditional media, North American fans of Square's games were largely in the dark about the upcoming software lineup. But to ensure excitement started to build, Square used one of their burgeoning-owned media platforms to inform their audience about Mystic Quest, and get them excited about what was billed as a game being made specifically catered to their unique interests. As a way of engaging and informing their audience, the North American branch of Square established a direct-to-mail newsletter called the Ogopogo Examiner. It was written by Ken Woolsey, and the first issue, published in the spring of 1992, featured information about Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy Adventure, and the first 2 Final Fantasy Legend games, as well as news that Square was developing a brand new game for the Super Nintendo CD-ROM system. The second newsletter, which was sent out in the fall of 1992, then had a massive focus on Mystic Quest. Woolsey started off the segment by stating that he had been receiving a high volume of calls from their fans asking if there were any games releasing towards the end of the year. They clearly missed the CES announcement and the subsequent coverage in the media. Based on this, the Ogopogo Examiner was used to deliver an elevator pitch as to why Mystic Quest was the perfect game for North Americans. Time was spent talking about the story. There was also space dedicated to leaning into the notion that North Americans found role-playing games too complicated, and that Mystic Quest was designed to be the most user-friendly game in the franchise, while also being very colourful and easy to pick up and play with regards to both the story and the gameplay. It played into every single assumption that had been made, and print advertising featured a similar messaging, with mentions of easy-to-read icons, there being a game anyone could dip into. And as a way of trying to sweeten the deal and emphasise their target audience, Square also decided to reduce the price point to $39.99, as a way of signifying to parents that this is a kids game as opposed to one designed for teenagers. Mystic Quest ended up launching in North America on the 5th of October 1992, just under a year after Final Fantasy IV had been released as Final Fantasy II. But despite Square's best efforts, there was limited fanfare. Coverage was found in the November issue of Nintendo Power, as it was featured with a 4-page spread in the Counselor's Corner alongside a review, and it was also featured in EGM. The same messaging was again clear, Nintendo Power trying to suggest Mystic Quest was the perfect entry-level role-playing game. However, the review that appeared later in the publication wasn't quite as positive, and with EGM's review also having a similar tone, it highlighted that critics were nowhere near as kind as Square had perhaps hoped, given how tailored they had made the experience to North American audiences. In Nintendo Power, its combined review score was 14.9 out of 20. The lowest individual score was around Challenge. It wasn't too surprising given the nature of the game, but perhaps the most damning aspect was that the scores were considerably worse than Final Fantasy IV, a game that Square had deemed was not suitable enough for the market. Nintendo Power's editorial team felt there was a regression in almost every aspect, except gameplay, with graphics, sound and fun seeing the biggest drop compared to Final Fantasy IV. EGM gave similar scores, a mixture of 7s and 8s, but even though there were positive sentiments, 2 of the reviewers made note that Mystic Quest was not a game for their usual audience, it was a game for the younger crowd. Despite this, one of the reviewers, dubbed Sushi X, felt that Mystic Quest should be popular amongst role-playing enthusiasts, and that even though it wasn't top tier, it was still high quality, and predicted that because it was likely to disappear from store shelves, people should get their pre-orders in early. This assertion turned out to be partially true, as there was indeed demand for Mystic Quest. However, the demand was nowhere near as strong as Square had hoped. Even though the development team had gone much further than the previous team had done with Final Fantasy IV, modifying the entire fabric of the game to cater it towards North Americans, it still didn't resonate that much to consumers, and by the end of the console generation, Mystic Quest had only sold 400,000 copies. This was still a decent return, and it was more copies than Final Fantasy IV had managed to sell, but given the lower price point, Mystic Quest ended up generating around 25% less revenue in North America than Final Fantasy IV, sitting around $16 million. And given the initial objective, this meant Mystic Quest ended up as a significant disappointment that only served to further influence the relationship the Square thought existed between Final Fantasy and North Americans. The Japanese launch of Mystic Quest ended up being an evolving movement. Due to how much the game was tailored towards North Americans, Square had no specific plans to release the game anywhere else. They believed that due to how much had been changed, it would no longer resonate with Japanese gamers, and did no proactive coverage in Japanese media to promote the game. No coverage even appeared until almost a month after its North American reveal at CES, and this perplexed enthusiasts in the region. Final Fantasy was one of the premium role-playing games to come out of Japan, and there was genuine confusion about why the announcement of a brand new game was not being shouted about in the rafters. Publications such as Famitsu were desperate to find out more, in lieu of anything being proactively provided by the publishers themselves, and this sought them to do their own investigations that were filled with speculation about what kind of game this might be. In the months that followed, Square started to become overwhelmed by interest in this mysterious new Final Fantasy game that they had learned was never to be released in their region. But after Famitsu learned from an unknown source that a Japanese version of the game existed as a standalone product, as it needed to be produced so that Ted Woolsey could then localize it into English for the North American release, it led to a significant increase in demand for this original Japanese language version of the game to be released. Square then relented and went against their original plan, and after this complete 180 had been decided upon, the marketing department then tried to make the best of the situation they'd been handed. What became known as Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest had appeared at Famicom Space World 93 alongside Romancing Saga 2. An original manga was produced and published in Family Computer magazine as a way of trying to engage fans and get them excited about the prospect of playing Benjamin, who is now renamed as Zash. What then happened upon launch ended up being quite ironic. Despite heavily campaigning for Famitsu for Square to release Mystic Quest in Japan, their review editors were not complimentary. Hirokazu Hanamura awarded Mystic Quest a 7, stating that while the graphics and sound were reminiscent of Square's previous games, the story felt forced, and the gameplay was so underwhelming, it felt like it was simply filling time due to a lack of engagement. They noted that the game could only be recommended to those who were looking to experience the world of role-playing for the first time. Rolling Uchizawa and Miki Watanabe both awarded Mystic Quest a 6. They noted that although the game felt like a role-playing game, there was almost no freedom and no strategy. Uchizawa even stated that the game was so simple that players could probably clear it just by mashing random buttons, while Watanabe, who had been blown away by Final Fantasy IV, stated the name Final Fantasy felt tacked on to try and sell copies because without the name, there was nothing about the game that got anywhere near close to resembling previous Final Fantasy games. That wasn't even the worst appraisal. Georgie Nipaji awarded Mystic Quest a 4, stating the game looked so bad it belonged on the Famicom, and that the gameplay felt immature, lacking the typical quality and surprise that Final Fantasy had become known for. This meant Mystic Quest was awarded a 23 out of 40, by far the worst score ever received by a Final Fantasy game, and by a considerable margin. Perhaps because of the muted initial response, sales were nowhere near as strong as previous games featuring the Final Fantasy brand. Only 40,000 copies were shipped during its launch week, with sales capping out at 123,000 copies in its initial run. Towards the end of the console generation, this figure had increased to around 300,000, but this was nowhere near what even the original Final Fantasy had accomplished on the Famicom. The game was considered a complete disappointment. In Europe, Final Fantasy was still a mysterious entity. By late 1993, 5 mainline Final Fantasy games had been released in Japan, and many of the offshoot Han and Saga games had been branded as such in North America. It meant that, as a collective unit, there had been 10 games released across the 2 regions that had been branded as Final Fantasy, but only one of them had ever been released in Europe, Seiken Densetsu, branded as Mystic Quest. When publications started to talk about Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, it therefore conjured up a lot of intrigue, but also a lot of confusion. To try and counteract this, the editorial staff and publications felt it was their duty to try and inform readers about the rich heritage of Final Fantasy in Japan. They were also hampered by a general lack of knowledge. In January of 1993, Jonathan Davies wrote an excerpt about Mystic Quest for Superplay magazine, and within, he also tried to explain the wider Final Fantasy franchise. Jonathan said that, to the best of his knowledge, Final Fantasy was a franchise that consisted of Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on the Game Boy, Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Final Fantasy 2 on the Super Nintendo, which he used was for some reason called Final Fantasy 4 in Japan. There was also Final Fantasy 5, also for the Super Nintendo, which he believed was going to be called Final Fantasy 3 in America, and Mystic Quest, which he noted didn't really fit into the series at all and was more of a spin-off aimed at younger audiences. Perhaps to avoid this kind of confusion spreading, the decision was ultimately taken to ditch the Final Fantasy branding altogether. But because the name Mystic Quest had already been used in this region, they had to further rebrand Mystic Quest as the Mystic Quest Legend. And this they positioned it as a follow-up to Seiken Densetsu as opposed to being a spiritual successor to Saga 3. Needless to say, it was all quite messy. When the game was released, perhaps due to their big limited exposure to the type of game, critics were underwhelmed by what was on offer. On GamesMaster, one of the biggest game-orientated TV shows aimed towards kids, the reviewers awarded it a 75%, likening it to being a more strategy-focused version of Zelda. But they also noted that the game featured almost no real innovation, and despite having a good soundtrack, it ended up being a rather dull game that would do little to convince anyone to stick to the role-playing genre if they'd never tried it before. Around 100,000 copies ended up being shipped across the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. But despite this being the first Final Fantasy game to be released in 3 different continents, Mystic Quest failed to break 1 million copies and generated the least revenue of any game associated with the franchise up until that point. Perhaps due to the poor performance of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest in relation to its appraisal from professional critics, its sales and revenue generation, and its reputation amongst the Final Fantasy community, for many years Square chose to effectively sweep the game under the carpet. It was only after more than a decade had passed that smaller references started to appear within the wider franchise. The first came by Dissidia Final Fantasy. Here, Moogles were given names that paid tribute to past characters, and one of them was named Benjamin. Mystic Quest was then re-released on Wii's Virtual Console, and although it skips the original version of Theatre of them, a few tracks did feature impertinently. There was also an allusion in Logica. These small aspects have helped to soften the stance on Mystic Quest, with specific appreciation now often seen in relation to its soundtrack. But in the broader sense, Mystic Quest served as a cautionary tale to Square about how they should be careful when attempting to build out the Final Fantasy franchise and catering too much to what they believe certain audiences want to see. And as they sought to produce sporadic spin-offs in the near future, this was a lesson they learned well. It also served as a fantastic learning experience for the development team, with many members going on to use their knowledge they gained on Mystic Quest to create the niche and well-regarded Treasures of the Rudras, but also a little game called Super Mario RPG. Thank you all so much for watching, everybody. My name is Daryl, and this has been the complete development history of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. It's an often overlooked game due to how much derision there is, but that doesn't make its development history any less fascinating. Hopefully, as you watch through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that you perhaps didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing, and editing this kind of video by giving it a like, and showing it around to anyone you think would be interested to learn more about this specific game. In truth, any interactions you make really help the channel out, so if you do genuinely like this kind of content, please do let us know. We're also very thankful for the support we receive on Patreon. Many of you know that creative efforts like this are a real labour of love. There's not too many people that are willing to go into this level of depth with Mystic Quest, but there's clearly an audience for it, and we are super grateful for people who have chosen to take that extra step and show us how much they appreciate our efforts by supporting us on Patreon. The likes of Benjamin Snow, Cloudcoin28, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Halomio, Justin Dent, and Super UK, or super special Honeynight supporters, exemplify this notion. We're incredibly grateful to all of you, and without your kind support, this channel would be very hard to maintain. You can help fund the channel for as little as $3 per month. And this gets you access to perks such as videos early when we can, frequent advertising, audio-only versions of our super long-form content, and voting rights to help us determine our next major project. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon with more Final Fantasy goodness.
I thought the concept was really cool, but ended up quitting somewhere in the middle. At the time, I thought it was because Moby Dick was just some old boring book that didn't spend enough time talking about the whoa, super rad killer white whale. Whoa, I'm a killer whale who eats the leg of a spot-fueled grizzly sea captain named Ahab. Now he seeks revenge. I'll get you, you damn dirty whale. Unfortunately, there were just too many pages about old wooden ships, too many detours, too much gabbing about how much nothingness makes up the ocean. Come on, I just wanted to read about an old guy getting revenge on a whale who bit off his leg. But when I went back to it later, I realized I was wrong. The story of Moby Dick, the story of Ahab, wasn't really a book about getting revenge on a whale exactly. It was a book about how unhealable wounds will come to define us, and how our obsession will be our downfall if no one, nothing intervenes. The whale is just the shape that wound takes. Captain Ahab doesn't chase the white whale simply because he hates it, though he sure hates it. He chases it because it's the only thing that makes his loss feel meaningful. If he can hunt it, name it, strike it, then maybe the chaos of what happened to him becomes something he can hold in his hand, and maybe heal from. I guess it's easier to fight a monster than it is to sit and accept grief, right? And the first time I really thought about it, I wasn't thinking about literature at all. I was actually thinking about Magus from Chrono Trigger. From our perspective, as the titular Chrono, Magus is a villain. He's responsible for a massive war and countless soldiers. He hurt our friend Frog in multiple ways. I mean, he even has a castle, a storm, and music, and everything. He's theatrical, distant, severe, chaotic, a whale in and of himself. At least to our friend Frog. But the closer you look at him, the less villainous he seems. And the more you look still, the more you see someone hunting his own white whale. Lavos. Lavos is Magus's white whale, and we have to start before this moment, before the hurt, because no one simply wakes up obsessed. They're wounded first. Before he was the great and powerful Magus, he was Janus, a child in Zeal, a beautiful city of enlightenment set in 12,000 BC. 12,000 BC? Is Jesus canonical to the world of Chrono Trigger? Well, I'm sure that's irrelevant. Zeal is a technology-enhanced floating kingdom where wealthy elites live in a world to themselves, where brilliance masquerades as stability, where people treat power as being bestowed by divinity itself. However, it's here where we get to see how the thirst for power and divinity drives the people of Zeal towards madness, and how that madness reaches its apex when it comes for Janus's family. See, Janus is Magus, but younger. Janus has a sister named Scala, and they have a unique bond, because they're both ignored by their mother, the Queen, due to her obsession with waking Lavos, a seemingly immortal space alien perceived as a deity due to his immense power. I always saw Scala and Janus as being so close because of the fact their mom was so distant and tyrannical. Scala and Janus, due to their powers and their identity as royalty, were so deeply isolated and othered, they needed one another in order to survive. And this shines in their relationship and their dialogue with each other. If you watch closely, you'll see that Scala played more of the mother role than the Queen ever did. And it's because of that love and that attachment that the wound of Lavos began to form deep inside of Magus. We watch as we see his mother, the Queen, and her obsession with Lavos cause her to slowly lose her mind, pushing her own children further to the wayside, reducing them to be tools that ultimately connect Zeal and Lavos. That obsession for Lavos would be the very thing that would bind Magus and his mother. Of course, for two very different reasons. More on that later. The Queen is able to summon Lavos, despite what everyone believed to be true. But that summoning, that power would come at a cost. Lavos would take everything from Janus by taking Janus himself and sealing him away far into the future in 600 AD. It's important to understand something here, and I don't want you to miss this. Magus doesn't just lose his context, his childhood home, his reality. He loses what is emotionally his whole world, as he's betrayed by his protector and sister Scala, by accident and against her own volition, of course. This is the wound that defines Magus. This is the moment the leg, the support structure of our own metaphorical Ahab is taken. He doesn't scream at the sky and swear revenge immediately.
Mendoza!
He quietly absorbs it all, which is what a lot of children do when something too big happens. They go quiet, they watch, they remember. Janus doesn't become obsessed yet. He becomes lost and quiet and observant. He learns. And somewhere inside of him, an ocean starts to form. Under his wing and teaches Janus about how the warlocks are ultimately the true rulers of this world and how blood must be shed to right this wrong. We really see Ozzy being a real-life example of
let the hate flow through you.
When we as Chrono meet Vegas in 600 AD, he's no longer a child. He's now fully formed. We do not know what he's up to, but we know he's bad. We corner him in the heart of the castle, and we find him summoning Lavos like a true villain, the architect of an apocalypse, just like his mother. But what is he doing really? He's trying to force the whale to the surface. He's not serving him. He's wanting to take from his power. He's hunting the white whale. And this is where we, the audience, first begin to see that maybe we misunderstood things. We see ritual and assume evil. We see isolation and assume arrogance. We see darkness and assume...
Oh, you think darkness is your ally?
But Magus is Ahab on the deck, projecting certainty so no one sees the wound underneath. If Magus can now define himself as the hunter, then he's not the betrayed child anymore. He's no longer the boy who was separated. He's the one doing the separating. And that illusion of control is intoxicating. Just ask his mother. Now 12,000 BC. And 12,000 BC is Jesus canonical to the world of Chrono Trigger? Well, I'm sure that's irrelevant. It's 12,000 BC. Magus has become the prophet. This is the strangest version of Magus so far, especially since nobody knows that he is the prophet. What's important is he's back in Seal, back near Scala, back near his mother, back near the moment everything collapsed, back to when the white whale Lavos took everything. Imagine that for a second. Imagine seeing the catastrophe that shaped your life and knowing it's about to happen again. For most of us, all we can do is imagine our lives differently. Imagine how we would respond, just go back to our worst, most defining moments. But Magus, in a cool and thoughtful fashion, gets to relive, potentially change everything about the way his life turned out. So he quietly guides events. He manipulates his own life. All to position himself. This is calculation. It must be handled with quiet and calm precision. If Warlock Magus is Ahab swinging the harpoon, Prophet Magus is Ahab trying to outthink the beast. And unfortunately, this is where his hubris catches up with him. When Magus realizes that he is not able to kill the beast with his own bare hands. When Lavos still effortlessly conquers. When Scala is still lost. When Janus is still ripped through time, doomed to repeat it all. Magus is shattered. This might be the coolest and most tragic moment in all of Chrono Trigger. He now knows the unbearable truth. It wasn't just chaos and bad luck or something that could have stopped him when he wasn't just a little kid. It was all inevitable. It was fate. And that kind of knowledge will hollow out a person to their very core. Because now he understands that even obsession can't undo the wound. But where there should have been certitude, where there should have been comeuppance, there's an unexpected ray of hope. Chrono, seeking to save his friends, inadvertently saves Magus. By accident, Janus was taken, but perhaps by fate, Magus was spared. Huh, I guess the whole Jesus thing really was relevant. Zeal has fallen, all is lost, and yet, we are now at the North Cape, on the lands underneath what was once Zeal. Here, the people from the sky dwell with the people from the earth. For Magus, something important has changed. Magus' fate, despite his efforts, has diverged from Magus. Magus is alive. But simply being alive doesn't make Magus suddenly forgive the ocean. He doesn't stop wanting to hunt down bottles. But he's no longer living in a place of hubris. He is, most importantly, no longer on this journey alone. When Magus joins the party, Magus isn't redeemed in some sort of hollow sentimental way. He's forgiven, accepted, and integrated. He still carries his wounds. He still carries his obsession, but now he's allowed it to be placed in a broader and better context. One that can care about the world, one that allows him to exist alongside others, just as the people of Zeal exist alongside the people of the earth. Magus, through his own emotional journey of understanding, forgiveness, acceptance, and compassion, is now fundamentally different without ever having to change who he is or his motivations. Jeez, Christianity really is written all over this thing. Who would have guessed? On my first playthroughs, I always thought Magus was a character defined by revenge. But after some consideration, revenge for Magus is just a surface expression of complete abject loss. I thought he was just cold, but coldness is often confused with control. I thought he chose darkness, but sometimes...
You really knocked in the dark.
Like Ahab, he stares into something vast and incomprehensible. Unlike Ahab, he is offered an unforeseen mercy that allows him to survive long enough to step back from it. And maybe that's why his story fascinates me after all these years. Because I too have whales that I'm hunting. Specific moments I wish to go back to and change. People I wish I could have told something different to. Failures that drag behind me like a weighted shadow. Then everything would make sense again. Then every wrong could be made right. In the world, my version of the world would be a happier place. But perhaps the reality where forgiveness finds us, or the reality where we're able to offer and accept forgiveness from others, is a reality more beautiful than the one we could have ever planned for ourselves. We're fortunate to have it, if we can find it. Here's my usual stuff at the end of the video. Hey, love Chrono Trigger content? Me too. Go ahead and like and subscribe. I've got some more coming down the pipeline. We're trying to work with every single main character. It's probably going to take me a whole other year to do that. If you don't want to miss any of these videos, let me know. Check out my old video on Frog, and then another video sort of talking about the role this game, or one quest that this game has played in my life. Thanks for joining me. I'm happy to have you here. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.
start having to unwind trades. They will have to also look past the AI bubble and say what's next. And there isn't any. And the longer that people cling to mythology, and the longer that people use these flimsy, half-assed ways of defending the AI bubble, the worse things get when it explodes.
On the Tech Report with me today is the writer of Where's Your Ed At and the host of the Better Offline podcast, Ed Ditchrow. Thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me.
People have compared the 2008 subprime crash to the AI bubble before, and we've spoken about it as well, but focused on some of the differences, in particular that the unbalanced overinvestment that we're seeing now as compared to the sort of irresponsibly sold and overvalued mortgages that were going around in 2008. With that said, in your newsletter this week you focus on the similarities and you spell out what you call the subprime AI crisis. If you could explain it, please.
If you remember The Big Short, there's the stripper with the 5 mortgages. This is kind of what the AI bubble is like. So if you think of it like this, the housing bubble, as people know it, was not real. It was houses bought and sold and all that, but the actual valuation of housing at that time was massively inflated by the easy access to money. The fact that anyone could get a mortgage. You had Washington Mutual, that was eventually acquired, I think, by Jacob Morgan Chase, that they were just giving out mortgages. There was a famous story of a mariachi singer who claimed to have 6 figures, and he managed to get his mortgage by showing a picture of himself as a mariachi singer in front of a house. So, in the same way that housing was massively overinflated, and indeed, the housing boom was only possible with lax mortgage investment, well, it's the same thing with AI. AI is not a real industry. If it was a regular industry that was held to the same standards as, I don't know, a regular business, like, hey, you need to have a path of profitability. Hey, you can't just lose 5 times what you make. It wouldn't happen. These companies wouldn't have the valuations they have, they wouldn't have had the scale they have. None of this would be possible. And the subprime AI crisis is so if you remember back in the 2008 crash and the lead up to it, people had these adjustable rate mortgages, so they started out with these low teaser rates that were very affordable, and people signed up to these mortgages even without really understanding what they meant. In the same way, AI startups are building on top of AI models that are going to get more expensive, that are only affordable when they have unlimited VC subsidy, and you have people subscribing to AI services like Claude who don't realize that they're building their workflows on top of something that has to get worse, that has to get more expensive, because right now they're heavily subsidized. This entire thing, the subprime AI crisis, as I call it, is what happens when the costs start becoming real, and when the companies in question, Anthropic and OpenAI, start increasing their costs as a way of rate limiting in some cases, as a way of starting to become more efficient. Well, I don't think this actually makes them more profitable.
You mentioned the rate limiting there, and Anthropic has given us a perfect example very recently of raising their usage limits, I think as part of a promotion, and then bringing them down, leading to lots of complaints about it. How are AI companies, or if we take Anthropic kind of specifically, how are they ever going to climb down from giving people £5,000 essentially, $5,000 essentially in exchange for 200?
So that's the thing, that's the subprime AI crisis. You misspoke in your last answer. It might make them more profitable, but I don't think it's going to make them profitable. Now, these rate limits are particularly grisly because what Anthropic did was in the middle of March, they started a 2x off-peak plan, so off-peak rate limit increase. And then a day before it was due to end, they then announced peak rate limit lowering. So during peak hours, which is like 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. Pacific, so just like all waking hours, I guess, rate limits would be much, much smaller. And if you go on Twitter, or X, the everything app, or whatever they're calling it these days, and search Claude limit, you will see people screaming like they're being stung to death by bees. Because the argument has always been in the AI bubble, well, this is what companies do. They just charge a little bit, and then when they get the attention, they get the users, they just raise the prices. Except when you look at how people are reacting to rate limits so that they can no longer burn thousands of dollars worth of tokens on a $200 a month subscription, or $130 on a $20 a month subscription, they are freaking out. These aren't people that are going to respond well to the idea that they're going to pay more or be able to use it less. And that's kind of the thing. That is the subprime AI crisis. it's really horrible, by the way. The people who lost their houses are victims of what I don't think is legally a crime but should be. I think the way that these mortgages were offered were disgusting. You have people talking about, oh, I had a negative amortization mortgage and I'm going to lose my house. That's because people built their lives on top of this unrealistic dream that they can actually afford these things. And they believe, instead of saying, wait, crap, I won't be able to afford this in 3 months or 6 months when the rate changes, they said, well, the housing market's only ever going up and I'll be able to refinance. In the AI bubble, there's a version of this where people say they're profitable on inference, they're not, there's no proof of that, there's none. Dario Amodei said it was a stylized fact, and Sam Altman said it in a dinner once, but there's no proof otherwise. They say, oh, well, they're getting more efficient. Oh, it's less dollars per flop or what have you. No one actually has any tangible proof, but people have this methodology that they use, so they don't have to think about reality. And that's the thing, with these rate limits for Claude, I think it's a scurrilous way to get people used to the new you. It's so that people get used to lower rate limits. But the thing is, what happens to the people that build their workflows on top of it? I'm not saying it's useful, I'm not saying it's good, I'm just saying that there are people that use it to write code who can now write less code. Anthropic's idea may be that people pay the API rate, pay for the models directly, but I don't think people are going to do that. I haven't found one person, and goodness, I looked, who has said, well, we were getting a good deal, I'm going to just pay the rate. Nobody says that. That's not how people work. People don't work, and people are not going to go, well, I was paying $200 a month for thousands of dollars in tokens, but I'll happily take $400. But then there's an empathetic way of looking at it. If you're used to being able to burn that many tokens, what the hell are you meant to do? And that is the rug pull that Anthropic is doing. OpenAI, by the way, immediately, got to hand it to Clammy Sam Altman, immediately they were like, yeah, we've just reset rate limits. Just like, it really is just like jumping off the Titanic, getting on the Enola Gay at this point.
Definitely did learn his lesson from the Pentagon deal, I think.
Remember that?
I do, yeah.
That was like a few weeks ago. Feels like a year ago.
It feels much longer. What maths are investors doing to rationalise that disparity between the costs and the prices being sold at? Is it that they've drunk the Kool-Aid of the Uber and the Amazon Web Service comparison, or is it just that kind of, well, I've already put some money in, I should probably spend more to try and get it back out again?
So I think there are a lot of them that convince themselves that something will change. I think there's a lot of that. I think there's probably a few cynical ones who just know. I do think it's the Amazon Web Services one, which is untrue, by the way. $51 billion normalized for inflation in 10 years to make the single most useful compute thing we've done in ever, like the backbone of the internet. And OpenAI has now raised $120 billion. Anyway, putting all that aside, I think that there is a lot of groupthink, and there is just this assumption that costs will come down. I don't think many of them have done the maths. My favorite one, though, is that you have a few venture capitalists just claiming incorrectly that Anthropic has positive gross margins on serving their models. There's no proof of this, and indeed, they have 45% gross margins, but Eric Newcomer of Newcomer Blog, that's the name, revealed in that blog that actually it's 45% gross margins on compute for Anthropic, but that's non-GAAP, so not generally accepted accounting principles. So it's just their moon math. It's just like, oh yeah, you know, I think what Anthropic does, and I base this based on the thing that Newcomer posted and indeed Dario Amodei's own statements, I think what he's doing is he's saying that the model costs this much to build, so Claude Sonnet 3.5 cost X number to build, and we've made this much money because of this, and thus the model is profitable, thus we have good gross margins. Now, I don't know about you, I'm crazy. Gross margins to me are like revenue minus COGS, cost of goods sold, and then the margin's that. But this is the AI bubble. We don't do that kind of messy margin math. We could just make stuff up. And I really think that's it, because at this point, if you're a venture capitalist that's heavily invested in this, if you have to think like me, you're going to start your car in the garage at this point. If you have to accept what I'm saying, you have to just be like, oh right, this probably won't work. I think a few of them are clinging to the idea that the next generation of NVIDIA GPUs is 10x more efficient. By the way, that's what they said about Blackwell. But that's the thing. What happens to all the Blackwells? They've sold, what, over $100 billion worth of these things now? What happens to the Blackwells? If they're not profitable, what are we doing here? And that's the thing. No one really has a good answer. To this day, no one has come to me with a good answer other than, well, Dario said it. Dario said it's profitable. Why don't you trust Dario?
Looking at some of the news you've seen lately, in your newsletter you said one of the pale white horses of the AI bubble is if data centers deals start getting delayed or cancelled. And in Bloomberg, they reported yesterday that almost half of the US data centers planned for this year are expected to be delayed or cancelled. And in fact, in the FT today, there was a story about a 2 gigawatt data center deal between the AI startup Poolside and CoreWeave. It's collapsed, and over what they call, I think it was strategic and timing reasons. I always enjoy how vague they are with the reasons that things fall through.
Strategic, they weren't going to do it. Time, there isn't enough time to do it.
I'm just wondering why doesn't Wall Street seem to care about this? That data centers are getting cancelled, delayed.
Well, that Bloomberg piece, by the way, is based off of the same research from my piece last week. So I guess if people want to be a week behind, they can read Bloomberg. But nevertheless, the call we've won as well, reported as an exclusive in the Wall Street Journal in October 2025. The reason that Wall Street is reacting is that Wall Street is run by babies, I assume, people who don't actually care about reality and have their own imaginary things, because if they did, they'd start freaking out. That poolside deal was for a 2 gigawatt data center for a relatively unknown startup. For a startup poolside that was like, yeah, we're going to make models, I guess, and we're also going to do AI infrastructure. Wall Street Journal, write that crap up. Just, yep, that sounds good enough for me. Dead. Less than 6 months later. And what was great was, in strategic and timing reasons, they then tried to sell it to Google. Google went, no, and then their funding round fell apart. The thing is, it gets back to what I was previously saying. If you have to start truly digesting what I'm saying, the world looks a bit scary and apocalyptic to a heavy level in this. Or indeed, even if you were just particularly bullish. Because this isn't something like the dot-com bubble, for example, where you could look back and say, well, people were using the internet did have this, like people were already transacting. It's not the same, because when they used a website, it didn't sometimes send them to a different website, or it didn't cost randomly $50 to access the website because your internet connection varies in price. The capex for that fiber lasts 15-20 years, GPUs 3 to 6. But if you stop thinking in a way where you rationalize everything using the past, everything seems crazy. 50% of data centers aren't getting built. That should create a market panic. It doesn't, because I think it's just a confidence game at this point. I think they all realize that if they start truly accepting gospel, my things I'm saying, they will start having to unwind trades. They will have to also look past the AI bubble and say, what's next? And there isn't anything other than the private credit bubble. That's going to be nasty.
On that, what do you make of OpenAI hitting its $825 billion valuation, with the combined news of it also apparently raising $122 billion in funding, which, for clarity, I assume is just the same one that we were talking about the other month, with the conditional funding reliant on achieving AGI or surviving that. Yeah.
It's the same thing, and that 825.50, I forget which it is, that's the post-money valuation, so something plus 120, not going to do the maths. I think that round is so weird, because other than the fact that it's barely half actually funded, NVIDIA already said it's the last time they're investing in OpenAI, and it's this strange thing where people don't seem that excited around it. They're all kind of limply going, yay, it's the largest funding round of all time. Like, no one seems... It used to be like a bit... When OpenAI announced their last funding round in 2024, it was like a $6 billion, I think it was, forgive me for not remembering. People were doing backflips. People were like, wow, it's a big day for Silicon Valley. Here they raised the biggest round of all time, and people were like, ooh, good? And I think it's because people realize this stuff is overvalued. There is currently a problem where secondary sellers, so OpenAI, private companies, startups generally private companies, you can't sell on the public market, but there are these secondary markets where you can sell your shares. So there's a story that's come out saying that there's about $600 million worth of OpenAI shares that people are trying to sell. Nobody's buying. Everyone wants to buy into Anthropic because Anthropic's cheaper. Anthropic's at $380, OpenAI's at $8 something. So people are like, I don't want to buy in at that high valuation. But here's the thing. I feel like if people thought OpenAI was going to be a $2-3-4 trillion company, now would be a great time to buy in. So people don't want to, which makes me think that people are also sort of realizing that everything's a bit weird. Because even with all that money, and this is really insane, even with all that money, Gunther said, I don't think Sam Altman can tell you how they go profitable. I don't actually think he can tell you how this business lasts 10 years, other than we will make more money, yes. And I think that is something people don't want to say, but are thinking about very, very hard. And I don't think anyone has a good idea or an answer. Same with Anthropic. The Koji Days, the one that Eric Newcomer published about Anthropic from end of December last year, that one was interesting because they believe it will be a multi-trillion-dollar company in a few years, but also that the cost of trading is not increasing at the speed of revenue. Still not actually true based on anything I read, but also that's not the same as becoming more profitable. That just means one thing is not quite going as fast as another. Everything is based on just these almost mimetic ideas, these little concepts they come up with to sleep better at night, bedtime stories to make the AI bubble talk not so scary. And I think I really want these companies to go public. I want to get in the guts there. I want to sit down with a big cigar and read their S1s, because once they actually file an S1, those things are audited. And I can't wait to see the audited financials of either of these companies, because they all look like a dog's asshole. These are well-run companies. And, I mean, every AI stuff is terrible business, but the worst of them is Anthropic and OpenAI.
One other story I saw in the news, which I kind of want to get your reaction to, was it kind of goes back to that data center stuff we were talking about earlier as well, is that Oracle laying off tens of thousands of staff with a 6 a.m. email to presumably fund building data centers, which presumably now half of which won't be being built this year. And I just wanted to get your reaction to that, to be honest.
Well, I mean, that's not totally fair. Sam Altman posted the other day that over in, I think, their Michigan data center, they have several steel beams. I'm not kidding. That was quite literally what he said. The thing is, it's not just the ones getting cancelled and the ones getting delayed. These are not delays. These are realistic timelines becoming reality. These things are always going to take years and years and years. The concept of a hyperscale data center is very new. We don't have a gigawatt data center yet, and to be clear, a gigawatt data center is actually a campus of several data centers, daisy chain. We don't have one yet. And Stargate Abilene, the one that I talked about, the big Oracle OpenAI data center, favorite subject, they are meant to open that by the end of the year. They do not have the third building ready yet. There are 8 of them. It's times like this I feel a little crazy, because you talk to people about this, tech journalists, investors, and they go, yeah, but they'll work it out. Yeah, they'll work it out. That is the best they've got. And it makes you feel a little nuts, because you're like, yeah, but if you look at what's happening, nothing actually matches up. And they just go, yeah, but it's fine. It's fine. And the funny thing is, when we compare to, I'm doing a big premium piece this week about how AI isn't too big to fail, partly just it isn't even close. I can get into that if you want, but the thing is with that is when you look back at what it was that people used to justify the subprime mortgage crisis, there was an insane piece in the New York Times in 2007 that said, we shouldn't stop subprime lending because it's going to stop poor people getting mortgages. And just to be clear, the subprime mortgage crisis and the near-prime mortgage crisis was not caused by poor people. Everyone got it. It was actually lower-income families had less access to housing during the time because the price of housing kept going up. It was middle-income, higher-income people who did it too, who also couldn't afford their mortgages. Putting all that aside, the rationale at the time was the housing market will keep going up. There's a Brookings Institute person who said, well, it's not a problem, delinquency rates aren't scary, and actually, as long as unemployment doesn't go up, we're fine. You'll never guess what happened. You'll never guess what happened. And that's the thing. I think we're in the hype cycle now, but I also don't think this is comparable to a previous era, at least not at the scale that people think it is. Like, you can't, like for like, say this dot-com bubble, because venture capital was much smaller back then, the markets were much smaller back then. It isn't like too big to fail, because there's nothing within this that's too big to fail. Too big to fail referred, of course, to the AIG and the destruction of commercial paper, which was how businesses and big banks and businesses like GE Capital funded their operations. The lending in general would have broken without the bailouts. TARP existed, also an important thing, TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program that was used in America. That was not used to buy houses. It was used to buy financial instruments that people had gambled with. It's why everyone's so angry at the banks for getting bailed out, because it wasn't like people's bad houses were bought. In fact, the 40-something billion dollars that was meant to do that just evaporated. It didn't really help anyone. That's the thing. I think people are, and I said this before, clinging to the ghosts of the past, dance with the ghosts, because if you look back and you say this is like this, it's this scary even if the thing in the future is bad. You can say, well, We were okay after the dot-com bubble. We were okay after the great financial crisis. No, we weren't. The current state of things, Trump, our current economy, the AI bubble, all of this kind of comes out of the fact that derivatives they were regulated to an extent. They weren't regulated hard enough. And after the great financial crisis in 2020, the Volcker rule, which was a part of the Dodd-Frank Act, which stopped speculating with customer money, the Volcker rule was changed under the first Trump administration to allow banks to invest in venture capital and private credit. All of this comes back to a lack of regulation. But none of this is something you can solve by looking backwards and justifying it, saying things worked out in the past in this way. This is nothing like that. And the longer that people cling to mythology, and the longer that people use these flimsy, half-assed ways of defending the AI bubble, the worse things get when it explodes. I don't care. I don't care if people agree with me or disagree with me. I love doing my work, but it's frustrating because consumers are still being conned into investing in these stocks. People are still being conned into believing that AI will be here. The subprime AI crisis I talk about, the customers of these AI companies are using them, believing these products will always work this way. But as Anthropic has shown with these peak hours for rate limits, and by the way, this isn't the first time they did something like this. Last year they added priority processing and service tiers, both OpenAI and Anthropic. They added these for enterprise customers. These things are only going to keep happening, and it's going to become blatantly obvious that the AI you use today just will not function the same way even in a few months, which will make your way of life under AI untenable.
Well, Izzytron, thanks for coming on.
My absolute pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode and you want to keep hearing more from the Tech Report, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, you can get episodes of the Tech Report wherever you get your podcasts.
Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X take place in the same universe. Not thematically, not as a fan theory, the actual writers confirmed it, and the connection between these two worlds rewrites everything you thought you knew about Mako Energy, the Lifestream, and the Shinra Corporation. So let's break down the strangest lore in Final Fantasy that nobody talks about, starting with the one hiding in plain sight, the Shinra-Spira connection. There's a kid in Final Fantasy X-2 named Shinra. Young Albhead prodigy, rides around on the Celsius, designed the garment grid and the comm sphere system. Smart kid, but here's where it gets interesting. He starts talking about extracting massive amounts of energy from deep within Spira to power Machina. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that is almost word for word what the Shinra Electric Power Company does with Mako Energy in Final Fantasy VII. Now, you'd think that's just a cute Easter egg, a little name reference, a wink from the developers, but it's not. Kazushige Nojima, the scenario writer for both Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, was asked directly if the two games are connected. He confirmed they are, he just refused to give specifics. But the X2 Ultimania guide filled in the gaps. It states that Shinra, the kid, can't finish his energy harvesting system in a single lifetime, but his work carries forward across generations, eventually leading to the founding of the Shinra Corporation on another planet entirely. That means Mako Energy is Farplane Energy, the spiritual lifeblood of Spira's afterlife, extracted, transported across worlds, and industrialized on Gaia 1,000 years later. Every reactor cloud blows up in Midgar is draining the same spiritual energy that Yuna fought to protect in Spira. The environmental collapse, the dying planet, all of it traces back to one kid on an airship who thought he could harness the afterlife. But if that cross-game connection caught you off guard, wait until you see what's hiding inside a single room that breaks reality entirely. The Moogle Room, Castle Oblivion in Kingdom Hearts. Chain of Memories already breaks reality. It's a structure that exists outside normal dimensional rules, where every room is generated from memories stored in cards. But inside this impossible building, there's something even stranger. You can use a Moogle Room card to open a shop that exists in literally no location whatsoever, run by Moogles who have zero concern about this fact. Here's the thing, these rooms operate on their own currency called Moogle Points, which you can only earn and spend inside the rooms themselves. Not money, not gil, Moogle Points. An entirely separate economy that has absolutely nothing to do with the world outside. You earn them, you spend them on card packs, and the Moogles pocket the difference. Inside a void, outside of time. But the distribution of these rooms is where it gets genuinely weird. They appear regularly in the early floors of the castle, become progressively rarer through the middle sections, then suddenly reappear on the final floor. There's no story explanation for this, no character comments on it. The rooms just decide when they want to be accessible, following some internal logic that nobody has ever been able to explain, and players can spend theoretically unlimited time inside these rooms grinding Moogle points without advancing the plot at all. Time inside them has no measurable connection to events happening outside. The castle could be collapsing around Sora, and the Moogles would still be in there, calmly restocking card packs and waiting for you to browse. The funniest part is that this functioning parallel economy has existed in canon for over 2 decades, and nobody asks questions about it. The Moogles are fully aware they exist in a dimensional pocket inside a dimensional pocket. They simply do not care. They are here to sell you cards, and interdimensional physics is not their department. But if you think a shop existing outside of reality is strange, wait until you hear about the origin story behind one of Final Fantasy's most powerful summons, the Knights of the Round's origin. Knights of the Round is the single most powerful summon in Final Fantasy VII. 13 medieval knights appear on screen, each one attacking in sequence, each hit ignoring magic defense entirely, stacking up to 129,987 damage in a single cast. It costs 250 MP, and it will one-shot almost every enemy in the game. Emerald Weapon survives it, Ruby Weapon survives it, the final boss survives it, and then, for some reason, Chocobos survive it too. Nobody knows why, but here's where it gets genuinely strange. To even get this materia, you need a gold Chocobo. Not a regular Chocobo, not a great Chocobo, a gold one, bred through one of the most tedious and elaborate optional breeding chains in RPG history. You ride that golden bird across the ocean to Round Island, a hidden landmass that doesn't even appear on the world map. And sitting there in a cave waiting for you is a little green marble containing 13 knights pulled directly from Arthurian legend. Think about that for a second. Every other summon in Final Fantasy VII has some kind of explanation. They're alien entities, planetary defense mechanisms, or manifestations of Gaia's magical energy. The Knights of the Round, they're King Arthur's boys from Earth mythology, just hanging out on an alien planet in an unmarked cave that you can only reach by breeding a golden bird. And the funniest part is that the community has spent decades min-maxing this summon, pairing it with Mime Materia, stacking it with W Summon, optimizing every possible damage combo. And almost nobody has ever stopped to ask the obvious question: why do medieval English knights from a completely different planet's mythology exist as a weapon here? The game offers zero explanation, no lore entry, no NPC dialogue, no hidden text. They just exist, and everyone accepted it because the damage numbers were too good to question. But at least the Knights of the Round have a physical location you can visit. The next mystery on this list doesn't even have that, because nobody can figure out who this character actually is. Go-Go's true identity: every character in Final Fantasy VI has a story. Terra is a half-esper weapon of war struggling with her own humanity. Locke is a thief haunted by the woman he couldn't save. Juan Qian watched his entire family die to poison. Every single party member carries deep personal trauma that weaves directly into the main plot. And then there's Go-Go, dawg. Go-Go is a recruitable character you find in the world of Ruin whose entire deal is mimicry. They can copy the abilities and attacks of any other party member, equip special skills from anyone in your roster, and functionally become whatever you need them to be in battle. They're one of the most versatile characters in the game mechanically, but here's where it gets genuinely strange. Director Yoshinori Kitase confirmed that Go-Go has no secret identity, no hidden backstory, no tragic past waiting to be uncovered. The character was designed without one, full stop, in a game